You're listening to Dodge Movie Podcast. Your hosts are Christi and Mike Dodge, the founders of Dodge Media Productions. We produce films and podcasts, so this is a podcast about films. Join them as they share their passion for filmmaking.
Welcome, everybody, to the first episode of the Dodge Movie Podcast. Happy Valentine's Day! Thank you so much for joining us. And we picked the best movie for Valentine's Day because it takes place on Valentine's Day, or some of the movie takes place on Valentine's Day. We are doing Sleepless in Seattle, which debuted June 25th, 1993. The director is Nora Ephron. It stars Tom Hanks, Meg Ryan, Rob Reiner, Rita Wilson, and Rosie O'Donnell. Nora's sister, Delia Ephron, was the producer, which I think is kind of fun. It's fun to work with family, right?
It totally is.
Okay. So we're going to start out talking about the writing, and we'll go into the cinematography, the editing, the sets. We're going to talk about the costumes, and then we both have some miscellaneous things we want to chat about, and then we'll run down the numbers. We're going to start with Mike's pickup line because he has realized that he's obsessed with how movies start. So Mike, tell me about what you thought about the way this movie starts.
The very first line in this film is "Mommy got sick." So Tom Hanks as Sam is telling his son that the son's mother has died. That's a pretty intense thing to start a romantic comedy on, right?
It's a very Disney movie.
Yeah, the mom dies in a horrific way, really tear-jerking the poor audience. We go into 3.5 minutes of Tom Hanks giving a very believable performance as a grieved widower. This poor guy, he yells at one of his coworkers. He's just struggling to get over this grief. And the first time you saw this, maybe you would think, this is a comedy? I walked into the wrong movie. So we get 3.5 minutes of that, and then we cut to the credits. And so the film as a whole kind of has a different feel than that first 3.5 minutes, but it really sets up, I think, that character of Sam as being very broken by his grief.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love when he's going through the cards that people have been giving him, all the parents without partners and support groups.
Parents, yeah. And so he kind of loses it on his coworker, which is probably fairly accurate. But then the meet cute is a standard part of every rom-com. And so we have, classics. You get stuck in an elevator, you knock somebody's coffee over, what have you. And here this is really kind of clever. It's off screen, right? So Annie's character is listening to a call-in radio program that the son is actually called into. So you're now seeing that they're not even on screen together. They're not talking together. There's no dialogue. But yet this is where these two characters, one is introduced to the other, right? He hasn't seen Annie yet. He doesn't know what's in for him. But so that I thought that was a really clever way to do that. And you could also, from a production standpoint, it's easier to shoot because you can shoot Meg Ryan on a totally different day than Tom Hanks.
Yeah, fun fact, they were only on screen for 2.5 minutes together.
And isn't that interesting? And they don't actually talk on the phone during that time, right?
Right.
So their interaction is really, she hears him talking on the radio program, and he gets a letter from her. There's a lot of people sending things through the mail that the other person doesn't want sent in this film. Kind of a classic bit. No seltzer humor. Yeah, some mail fraud. Yeah, we'll get to the wire fraud later.
Yeah, I wrote in my notes, it's an auditory female gaze because she's lit so beautifully by like the street lights or the dashboard lights that are in her car. And she's looking straight ahead, just listening to his voice, which is really intimate, as all of you know right now. But and I just think that she was slowly or quickly falling in love with him. Just, we see that on her face.
And so we have Bill Pullman as Walter, the classic Bellamy. There's nothing wrong with the guy, but there's nothing right with him either, right? So as the audience, right, we can't hate the Bellamy. We need to kind of like this guy, but realize he's wrong for her. And Pullman does a fantastic job at this. I'm sure as a person, he's much more entertaining, but that character Walter is just flat, right? There's nothing going on there. And so she is using that as a foil to show that Annie has Walter, and she keeps trying to convince herself and others that Walter is the spice of her life, but that's not true. She keeps being drawn back to this character, Sam, who remember, she's never seen before. So in this film, even though she hires a private detective, there's photos are only very much near the very end when she's almost at the point where she sees him in person anyway. So as this evolves, it's all, as you said, auditory. There's no gaze, right, that we're used to in a rom-com.
Yeah. One of the things that I think Nora does so great, and the actors who are in it, they tell us so much by their looks. So there's a couple scenes where Walter will say something, they're dancing. And so she kind of looks over his shoulder and shows the audience that she's like, something he just said gives her pause and makes her start to think, is this really the person for me? And then 2 separate times Annie's talking about Walter to Becky, played by Rosie O'Donnell. And we hear what Annie is saying, but we see Rosie's face, and her reaction tells the audience that Walter's not the bee's knees.
Right. And there's a lot of show don't tell in this that I liked about the way this was written. There's good exposition by way of signage. The Capitol Diner tells us that Annie's in D.C. The Baltimore Sun sign on the outside tells us she's in Baltimore to work. But also when Tom Hanks's character of Sam is sitting in the restaurant waiting for the date, and he's building a tower out of the sugar cubes. And so that, shows us that he's an architect. He's thinking in terms of building things. Now, one thing that bumped me about being an architect, in addition to the fact that since Mike Brady, it seems like it's the coolest profession. I don't know if it's at all like we see in the movies, but they go to the house and there are so many contractors working. And I have never in my life seen more than one tradesman working in the same house at the same time, right? I don't know how they got a dozen guys to all be working there. But it makes for a great chaotic scene.
Do you want to talk about the scene with her and her mom in the attic at kind of near the top of the movie?
Right. So what we've seen is the dinner where Walter has proposed to her. And so Annie's mother takes her up to the attic to get Annie's mother's wedding dress and try it on, which, by the way, production note, always get your attractive actresses in lingerie. That helps with seats. Getting butts in seats. But so the mother is talking to Annie, and Annie is giving us this spiel that she doesn't believe in magic, right? Setting up a narrative question that we're going to answer throughout the rest of the film. And there's the dress that she puts on, and then it rips, and she says it's a sign. And so now what we've done is we've seen in the film there's this question about whether there's magic, whether there's kismet. And as the mother tells the story about how she met Annie's father, the camera pushes in and makes this a very intimate moment between a mother and a daughter as you see this play out where she says something about their hands. They held hands and she couldn't tell where his stopped and hers began, which, by the way, sounds a little bit weird when she says it, but I think metaphorically speaking, it makes sense. I'd be worried if she didn't actually know where her hand ended.
I just realized as you're talking that Nora obviously wanted to use the theme of hands, because then later Tom Hanks is talking about his dead wife, and he took her hand to, I think, help her out of a cab.
Yes.
And he said
that's when he knew she was the one.
Yeah, because
and then
it felt like home, I think he said, and he said all I could say was hello.
Right, which was a line from An Affair to Remember, which, of course, the women in the film are obsessed with. But also note that I believe at the end of the film on the observation deck, Annie and Sam hold hands.
Yes, which we will have a smoochie count, because anytime we're watching a romantic comedy and the 2 leads kiss, Mike shouts out, "Smoochy, smoochy, smoochy!" And this film, 0 smoochie count.
0 smoochies.
You've got these 2 lead actors, Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan, would naturally kiss at the end of the movie.
You think?
And nothing. This is a very PG. It was rated PG.
In certain senses, it's a classic rom-com, but in other ways, it violates some of the basic assumptions of the genre, such as having a kiss.
Yeah. Now, it's interesting because one of the trivia that I found, I'm just going to kind of sneak it in here, is Dennis Quaid was slated to be the male lead. And at the time, him and Meg Ryan were married.
So you'd hope they'd have better chemistry than others, but chemistry wouldn't really matter as much in this film because they spend so little screen time together.
True enough.
And in retrospect, can we see it as anybody but Tom Hanks?
No,
I don't think so.
I can't.
Yeah, so as far as the cinematography goes, one of the things I noticed early on in the film is any shot that had a lot of sky was exposed for the sky and not the characters. So when Tom Hanks is in his architect office in Chicago yelling at his coworker, or when Meg Ryan is coming up the walkway in Baltimore to her family's house, it's exposed for the sky, and the actors are actually fairly underexposed, which is a little bit odd, right? You get big stars and you don't light them particularly well. But I think the choice there was to make them seem they weren't quite as alive yet, right at this point in the film. This is indicating kind of the world that they're living in. They're kind of in a darker place.
I agree. I wrote down that twice when he comes home in Seattle, it's raining. And there was a comment by, I believe, 2 different characters about the amount of rain that drops in Seattle. Or it could have just been they were filming in Seattle and it happened to be raining that day. But I felt like they were trying to show that he was in such a dark, overcast, dreary state of mind when he moved to Seattle.
As a person who loves rainy days, I don't know if I can quite sign off on rainy days being a sign of melancholy, but I understand a lot of people do. No, this is also interesting because we have a scene where it's raining during the day, and you almost never see that in movies, right? The rain is almost always at night because it looks so much cooler when there's the lights and the wet streets. But yeah, there was rain there. They also had a nice shot that I really liked where early in the film, Sam is sitting on a bench, it looks like, inside his house, talking to Dr. Marcia Fieldstone on the phone. And behind him is a framed print. And he's on the right third. And on the left third, reflected in that glass of that print, are the twinkling lights in a Christmas tree. And so it's a beautiful shot, and it shows us that it's Christmas time. And to me, it brought up the absence of the wife, right? And so it really kind of made him look lonely. So I thought that was a really nice shot. And then a little bit later in the film, he walks through his houseboat, up the stairs, and like down a hallway. And that was one seamless shot. And so mad props to the camera operator because we had some tilts, we had some pans, we had some dolly. Oh my, that was quite a shot.
I love listening to you talk about this stuff. I loved this scene. There was a lot of mirroring in this, which I guess is I'm kind of stepping on editing's toes here, but there's a lot of mirroring in one of the scenes that I really enjoyed was it was at night, like you were saying. There were lights, the streets were wet, and Annie was in Baltimore and Sam was in Seattle, and they were both sitting at the edge of water. So you've got the lights reflecting off of the water. Mm-hmm. And they're both just kind of pensively looking out over the water, and we cut back and forth to either one of them.
Yeah, nighttime shots are difficult because the absence of light, it's nighttime, makes it visually uninteresting sometimes. So those reflected lights are a really nice touch. It gives a sense of both perspective about where the character is, but also gives the audience something to look at. It's not just a black screen.
Right. That's why they often wet down the street.
Mm-hmm.
So that you get that reflection.
I'm curious if neon lights will go away, but we'll still have them in movies because they look so cool at night.
Mm-hmm. Any other cinematography things that you liked?
Well, there's some really nice focus push and pull throughout the film. And one thing that I noticed interesting is you generally don't see a lot of real fast zoom. But in this case, when the private investigator was in the restaurant and he was in a balcony and he had a weird looking little camera, but as he zoomed in on Sam's character, we actually zoomed the image that the viewer was seeing, so I thought that was kind of a clever thing because it stuck out to me. So like with a lot of these things, the lighting is gorgeous, right? They knew what they were doing when they lit them. And so they all had these wonderful catch lights, especially inside Tom Hanks' houseboat, which had windows on one end. And so I don't know where all those catch lights were coming from, but they looked real nice. And then at the end of the film, there was they used a very soft gel. It looked to me like they had a soft gel on when they were shooting Meg Ryan specifically on the observation deck. So only her close up, not on the two shots or anything. And it was very much reminiscent to the older films like An Affair to Remember, where in a previous era of Hollywood, we would gel all of the lead actresses because they were gorgeous people and it made them look even more gorgeous. And so I thought that was a very nice touch. Obviously, the camera loves Meg Ryan. And in this film, that at the end of the film, I only noticed it at the end. It was such a nice little touch to put it over the top.
So I may steal your thunder here, but the editing in this, which thank you, Robert Reitano, for editing this film, because I think he did a brilliant job. There was lots of mirroring actions that were happening. And one of my favorites is Tom Hanks is on a date at the houseboat and Jonah is very angry. And he walks over to the phone and he picks it up and he starts dialing. And we cut to Annie's bedroom. And I even looked at you and I was like, how did he get her phone number? And then Annie answers the phone. And so, of course, as the audience, we think it's going to be Jonah on the other end. And it's Rosie O'Donnell. And then cut back to Jonah and he called the radio program. But the editor made us think that it was something completely different. I enjoyed that.
My favorite edit was Annie's character is leaving her brother's office and she opens her and goes through it, but they cut to an exterior shot of the door opening and then Sam and his good buddy Marty DeBurgi come out of the door. And so that was a really nice cut, I thought. The composition of the shots matched the door frames as well, but it was a really nice edit.
Yeah, good job, Robert. That was good. So sets were a big part of this movie too.
Yeah, and I include in here props as well as just actually the location itself. Mm-hmm. And so one of the props that played a strong role were Kleenexes, curiously enough, for Walter to represent his allergies. And there was a great gag where he's sleeping and every time he breathes out through his nose, the Kleenex kind of waves. That don't know how long that took to set up, but that was a good shot. But there was also nice touches. So during New Year's Eve, the first one there, Sam and Jonah are playing Monopoly to keep presumably Jonah awake, even though he falls asleep because he's a kid. And then throughout the rest of the film, you can see the Monopoly box is on a shelf in his room. So it's those little things. There's a picture of his mom next to his bed so that they can have this great shot where he's laying there, closes his eyes, presumably thinking of his mother, and then out of focus just behind him is this frame shot of her. So I also thought there was this rose color to the walls in Annie's house that was really a little gross to me. I'll be honest. I maybe it's realistic color, but that was a little off-putting. But you saw that color recur other places, including the drapes in the hotel. So there was certainly a strong color palette that was used for Annie and for Sam. And we saw that. Now, the houseboat is a really cool setting. This is like living on a boat in Miami Vice or something where it seems really cool. I don't know if houseboats are actually that stable. I've never lived on one. But it seems like the TARDIS because it was so huge on the inside, but on the outside, it looked to be about 20 feet wide.
You were talking about things that bumped you. And I said, this houseboat defies the laws of physics because it was so big on the inside. The kid's room was, I think, bigger than our bedroom. Yeah. And this houseboat that, okay, maybe has a second floor would not be big bedrooms.
Yeah, I don't think so. And also notice the architecture, which matches him being an architect. But would you spend the money on those giant beams in a houseboat? I don't know. Maybe you would. I'm not an architect. But you'll notice that the color palette for her house was also kind of mimicked in Becky's office at the Baltimore Sun. Again, I don't know if that's realistic or not, that people could get their office changed. But then there's lots of grays at Sam's house, the interiors. There was a nice blonde wood, but the rest of the colors were grays and washed out, which you could say calls to the skies in Seattle, but also to kind of his mood, his heart, kind of where his emotions were at.
Mm-hmm. What about some of the costuming? We had a color theory conversation after we watched this.
Oh yeah, I mean this was certainly a thing that I paid attention to. Shout out goes to Miriam Tallis for teaching me about costuming and making me start to look at these things. But certainly Annie's character, you see red is her color. So obviously red lipstick is not that far of a stretch for her character, but she wears a lot of red, different shades of red, but mostly that really bright Valentine's Day red. And so Sam, on the other hand, he has various shades of blue, which is, from the water, but also the melancholy of blue. And there's a bluish green that you'll see sometimes that comes in, which again kind of goes to the seawater motif, the Seahawks. So definitely those two characters are established. They have their color palettes established. And also you can check on the kinds of clothing they're wearing. You see that when he's in his house, Tom Hanks wears sweats quite a bit, which is nice and comfy. I think everyone would. He and Jonah both wear the sweats a lot. And then at the midpoint of the film, you can then see Annie for the first time wearing sweats. So she's got on the gray sweats, but she has a red hoodie on because red is her color. And we see this kind of come to fruition at the end of the film. So when Jonah gets on the plane to go see Annie, or to set up the meeting, he has on a red jacket and a red backpack. And then when Sam gets on the plane, he's wearing a red shirt. And then when Annie gets to there, she has a blue dress or a blue coat on. So now they're mimicking each other's colors. And another thing that I thought was really kind of a nice touch is Jonah has under his red coat, he has a yellow hoodie. And that yellow matches Sam's jacket. So we really see, very primary colors, the red, the yellow, the blue. But we see that in costuming, they went very strong on those colors identified with each of the characters. But I think you noticed something about her hair.
Well, I was trying to decide, was it just how women did their hair in the early 90s? Or I noticed that they only left Meg Ryan's hair down long when she was at home. And she's a journalist, and sometimes she was even like in a hotel room or not really on an assignment. And her hair was always it was always up. She always had it like in a loose braid, or it was pulled back loose when she left the house. And it was only when she was at home that it was down. Now, maybe that was just completely arbitrary, but I think that she would have, thrown it up in a ponytail or something. I don't know. Maybe it's because I was a little bit of projection because I don't like my hair down. But yeah, I just noticed that her hair was always in quite a coiffed state when she left the house.
And of course, Meg Ryan looks great on screen, but certainly whoever did the makeup made everybody look gorgeous as well, which I think is maybe a little unrealistic for a journalist. I'm not sure that she would focus quite as much on her on-screen persona because she was working for a newspaper, but I think it worked in the film.
One thing I wanted to talk about was casting. So Victor Garber is in this, and I love Victor Garber. And so, there's that great scene where him and Tom Hanks are making fun of Rita as they're crying over the Dirty Dozen, making fun of her crying over An Affair to Remember. So that's fun to see him in this movie. And then Gabby Hoffman, who I love in Transparent, a young Gabby Hoffman. She's probably in her tweens when she was in this film. First of all, she made up all the abbreviations that we use in our texts. It's my
LMAO
contention. Yes. She does H and G.
Hi and goodbye.
Mm-hmm. And I would say you and I are MFEO.
Made for each other.
Very good. So that was kind of fun. And then
it was fun.
As her and Sam are committing what you call
wire fraud.
Yeah. They're buying Sam a ticket so he can go to New York. He says, nobody's going to believe that I'm 12 years old. And she says, if it's in the computer, everyone knows it's true.
Yeah. And that's still true to this day.
To this day.
The internet is full of nothing but truth.
So I enjoy Gabby in this role.
I also thought it was fun that we had Rob Reiner as his friend, and I saw him throughout the entire film as Marty DeBurgi from This Is Spinal Tap.
Yeah, you love Spinal Tap.
I do, and I think it would be funny if Marty went to work as an architect or a construction foreman in Seattle because the documentary went so poorly.
So I will admit to complete bias. on this, and you're getting a little behind the scenes, everybody. Since this was our first film, I immediately go up to Tahoe. I'm working. On my off time, I'd walk around and I would listen in what had to be a Walkman or something, because we didn't have iPhones or even an iPod back then. And I would listen to this soundtrack over and over and over. And there are some great songs in this. And it's a little on the nose. I think today's audiences would hate this, but I loved it. And I thought it was a smart use of the songs, because like I wrote down, oh shoot, I forgot to write down what the name of the Nat King Cole song is, but it perfectly describes how Sam's feeling. He's longing for his wife.
Great song.
It's a beautiful song. And he goes out once again, it's at night. And so you get these beautiful night shots, and he's looking into the sky, and you've got this haunting Nat King Cole song. And then when Tom Hanks is trying to psych himself up because he's going to call a woman out for a date, something that him and Rob have talked about he's really uncomfortable doing, they play, is it Gene Autry, Back in the Saddle again?
Yeah, they do Back in the Saddle again.
So like I said, it's a little on the nose, but I think it added to the comic relief. It really informed what was happening. It played so well that it didn't upset me or offend me at all.
I think modern audiences would expect them to sing a bit more. So maybe we can get Hugh and Michelle to come back and redo this one.
That was a tease, everybody, because we will do The Greatest Showman at some point on this podcast. How about you, Mike? Did you have any other last minute miscellaneous things before I go into the numbers and some of our special features that we have planned?
I just want to make a special note of the dedication of actors to the role, because the woman that played his girlfriend in the middle of the film had to practice that laugh. So she was walking around town or driving in her car doing that laugh. And she had to hear that for hours on end before we got on screen. So credit to her for that.
I like that you're giving her credit that it was an acting choice. I thought to myself, this poor woman laughs like that.
Yeah, let's say it was a choice. If it wasn't, we'll just let her have that one.
Okay. So you ready to hear the numbers for this film?
Let's hear the numbers.
So the budget was $21 million.
Cheap.
Because we know, let's see, how many locations not locations, but how many companies would there have been? At least, 4? Seattle, New York, Baltimore, right. And then DC. Did we go to? Yeah, four locations, major locations too. Mm-hmm. It has an IMDb score of 6.8.
How can that be?
I'd give it way higher. I'd give it an 8 at least.
Oh, easily an 8 at least. And I'm admitting that I have a personal history with it. But remember, we also like Joe versus the Volcano. So it's possible that a lot of folks don't get Tom Hanks' work like we do.
Right. Yes. Another little tease, Mike. Good job for promotion, because we are definitely doing Joe versus the Volcano on this podcast. So if you hate that movie, get ready. And if you love that movie, get ready.
Mm-hmm.
Oh. So it is 1 hour and 45, I think, perfect length.
Yeah, it's good length. Doesn't feel long.
Yep. Rated PG. Mike's pause count. So we will talk about this at every episode. If you watch a movie or a TV show with Mike.
And it can pause, I will pause it.
He will pause it.
So I like to pause on things that I want to talk about.
Right.
So I don't miss any important dialogue, or I can point something out on screen. Christy can validate that at least half the time I'm talking about the lighting. So I can kind of obsess about this. I'll see catch lights and I'll say things like, where did that light come from? There's no X in the scene. There's no candle. There's no light. There's no what have you. But also I like to capture things that are on the screen that look in the background, right? Notice that there's the tool chest that will be used later. Was it Anton Chekhov or Ensign Chekhov that said if there's a gun on the wall in the first act, somebody gets shot in the third act?
Many things that you have taught me that I did not learn in film school. That one and what catch lights are.
Yeah, I'm also obsessed with catch lights as well as the first line in any film.
Yes. So this movie's pause count was 7, and that's not counting the times that you paused just to see what where we were in the movie, like the time code. That was 7 times he had to stop and talk about something that was going on in the movie.
Which is low.
That actually is. Well, because we were, it was kind of homework, so we were trying to work. Did I already say this movie cost $21 million? It made $126 million.
It's a hit.
Domestic. Did quite well worldwide with practically doubling that at $227 million. So I'd say it's a hit.
Absolutely. It's no by Big Fat Greek Wedding, but it's a good one.
Right. Another thing that we're going to go over is head trauma, because we enjoy comedies and they often involve head trauma. And this movie only had one scene of head trauma.
Because there's nothing more romantic than subdermal hematomas.
Yeah. I think Meg Ryan gave him like a backhanded left when the phone rang.
Yeah, I think it was phone-related head trauma.
Yeah. So now we're going to go into something that we're going to do on every podcast, or at least the podcast where it's relevant, and that's Mike's driving review.
So you'll see driving in a lot of films. The United States is a big country with a lot of roads, and in this case, we see Annie driving some boring sedans. She has what's presumably her car back in Baltimore on the East Coast, and then there's a car she rents in Seattle, and they're both very boring four-door sedans, which presumably is to tell us that she's kind of a boring character. But I think if you've traveled all the way across the continent to stalk someone in person, you go for something either like functional, a windowless panel van where you can put the body, or you go something fun and sporty, maybe a convertible, even though it's Seattle, something fun. She doesn't. And I have to say, she's a horrible driver in this film. She doesn't pay attention to the road. Half the time, she's got a map in front of her face. She's looking out the window. She's thinking about Tom Hanks. Okay, 9 and 3 hand position, both hands on the wheel, both eyes on the road. That's what I would ask. So I think there's an opportunity here for that character to improve her driving skills.
I don't think she would get something flashy, though, when she goes to Seattle, because she's trying to blend in and she doesn't want Sam to see her. So I'd go panelist van.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. And then lastly, our big fun feature of the podcast will be, especially more for older movies than more current movies, Can't Make This Today. My two are early in the scene where they announce that Walter and Annie are engaged. Walter has a sneezing fit and makes no attempt,
not even the slightest,
to vampire sneeze or use his napkin. He is sneezing all over the food. And it pulled me out of the movie because I felt like in this day and age, people have the decency to turn their head or cover their mouth in some way, but he had no disregard for the family style meal that was on the table that he was completely sneezing on.
Well, he maybe would argue it's allergies and not a virus. I don't know.
No. I'm not even talking about the virus. A year ago, I would have had problems with Walter, and maybe my OCD is creeping in here a little bit.
You think if he was a lifelong allergy sufferer, he'd be clear with the vampire sneeze?
Yeah, and you're at a dinner table. There's a napkin on your lap.
And you're about to propose to this woman's family, and you're going to sneeze on them?
Right?
Doesn't seem like a savvy strategic move.
Couldn't do that scene today. So how about you, Mike? Did you notice anything that couldn't be done today?
Well, there were actually two things. One is there's a scene where Walter and Annie show up and kind of a doorman goes to get the door. And it's an attractive young black man dressed in what must be like a 17th century English footman's outfit with waistcoat and tails and top hat.
And white gloves.
And white gloves. It felt way too antebellum for me. I just don't know that we can make that today. And the other thing is the kind of cute stalking that goes on isn't so cute anymore. She doesn't just cyber stalk him. She actually hires a private detective and then flies across the continent to physically go to his residence 2 separate times. That's pretty stalkery. And post Rebecca Schaefer, I don't know if that should play as well as it did.
Right. Some misdemeanors or felonies, I think, were committed.
Right. We also have to throw in the wire fraud that Jessica committed to order round trip first class plane flight for her friend using her mom's credit card.
Right. And good point. I don't think that Jonah would be allowed to fly without being checked in with an adult with all 10 types of ID forms or something.
I think by 1993, we'd started to try to keep our children around.
Yeah. Couldn't be done today. Couldn't be done. And on the back to the stalking, she would have there would be no need for the private eye because she'd just look on his LinkedIn or his Facebook page.
Right.
She would know everything about him. As an architect in Chicago, he would have had probably, even if he worked for a firm, he would have an about him page. I mean, she would have known all kinds of things about him.
Remember the good old days when you had to drive by someone's house and hide across the street to spy on them?
High school.
The good old days.
So I think that just about does it for Sleepless in Seattle. If you couldn't tell, we love this movie. It has a special place in our hearts. And we hope that you enjoyed this podcast and listening about the movie. Hey, everybody. Next week, we're going to be reviewing an indie film that Mike found for us called Plus One. It's available on Prime. So if you'd like to enjoy it with us and watch it before we break it down, watch it before next week.
We hope you've enjoyed our little chat today about Sleepless in Seattle. Dodges never stop, and neither do the movies. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to Dodge Movie Podcast with Christi and Mike Dodge of Dodge Media Productions. To find out more about this podcast and what we do, go to dodgemediaproductions.com. Subscribe, share, leave a comment, and tell us what we should watch next. Dodges never stop, and neither do the movies.